Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Data Talks. This is a very special occasion for me. I'm speaking to my previous boss, Philippe Le Houérou. He has a very distinguished career with the World Bank, also with the European Bank, previous managing director and CEO of the IFC. Welcome to the show, Philippe.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Glad to be here with you.
So good to have you, Philip. Obviously, you were a legendary person at the World Bank. I think everybody would say that who worked with you or interacted with you, and a very long career. But we always start with a person and how it all started. And in your case, and I know this through our own interactions in Africa, it started in Ethiopia. So tell us about your time in Ethiopia at school and how that shaped you.
Well, I arrived in Addis because I was following my father, who had the job there for research. He was a scientist and working on climate change, although at the time it was not called like this. And that was in 73, 74, 75. That's what we're talking about. And that was also when the Derg got rid of the emperor, Haile Selassie, and started the revolution. So, and here I was at the last year of the French school, it's called terminal, literally the last year of the high school. And then you go to university. So I was in terminal, I was 17 and in Addis Abeba just during this, the beginning of this revolution. And so my focus at school was really math and science. Why? Because it was easy. Not that it was easy for me, but it was good input-output ratio. It was so important as a coefficient for the general average that a little effort in math was better, went much further than a lot of efforts in French or English or geography or history. So it was for me a way. And then my father was, a scientist, so I was being pushed in this direction. But then in Ethiopia, I started to see after this revolution, or during the revolution, a lot of young Ethiopians, including in school, in the French school in Gebre Mariam in Addis Abeba, being killed and tortured, and that in the name of three white men from a century ago, like Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So three white men in the middle of Africa, in a country that was an imperial country with a very traditional structure. And for these three guys, people were killing themselves. So it was very hard for me. And again, that's why I said I was in mathematics. I was not into politics, literature. Maybe it will have helped me to understand, but I couldn't understand. It was just that simple. I just couldn't understand. And to be honest, sorry, I take a little bit of time on this one, but I can say that since then, since 17, that traumatic experiment for me, it was really traumatic, but it was also foundational in the sense that I spent really the rest of my life trying to understand this basic question. Why do you kill young kids? I mean, 17, 18, 19 students in the name of principles and ideology that is imported. It's not even yours. I mean, just and not necessarily adapted to your condition. I didn't know all this, so I read everything Marxist. I read all Marx, including Das Kapital, that many have not read, and it's very difficult to digest. I read all Lenin. I read Engels. I read everything. Because it was distributed for free, by the way, by the revolution. That was the only perk of this thing. But it was a very tough thing. It was very violent. There is a museum now in Addis on this period. It's what's called the Red Terror. And if you go to this museum, it's a very small one, but it's mostly photograph and artifacts. It's horrible. It's really, I'm sure there are plenty of those during the history, many of those, but that's the one I witnessed when I was at 17-year-old. very impressionable, and at a point where I had to decide my life. In fact, I thought it was all directed. I would have ended up as a scientist or a medical doctor or something. But that was there was no question. I mean, it was really on a one-track mind. Um, but Ethiopia kind of hijacked completely and shaped my whole career and my whole life, to be honest, and many things that I thought and triggered the questions. And, as you know, one question triggers another question, and you start digging and digging and digging and digging. So I'll stop here. But it was really traumatic and foundational for me.
Hmm. And Philippe, you I think previously even call it like that ideology kills. And how is this in contrast to then later the life when we met right at the World Bank? Why was that work in development such a contrast for you to the experience you just shared with us?
Well, I mean, again, fundamentally, little by little, and the fact that, again, science was important in my life, evidence-based analysis and then conclusion and their action for me became very, very important. I realized that if you don't do that, you substitute that by a ready-made ideology that may fit or not fit reality. And when reality doesn't fit an ideology, then this is where the violence starts, because you try to push it by force. So that's kind of, I'm taking a lot of shortcuts here, but that's what I found. So I felt good at the World Bank, and that's why I stayed much longer than I expected to, because it was fundamentally evidence based. The premium of data was very important. I think we should have done even more to develop the data systems in countries, but the bank has done some, could have done more. But for me, it was the only way, because when you're faced to a problem, um, you have two way. You need to, when you're a decision maker, okay, you have to make a decision. Now, how do you make a decision? Based on what? Some kind of analysis, okay, but what is the input to the analysis? If you can, you have the data. If you can't, you substitute by the ready-made set of preconceived ideas that come from wherever in history. And that is when it becomes dangerous for me. And that's the bank, by being evidence-based and based on data, was important. By the way, one thing you can quote, it's a quote from Wolfenson. I know I told you that the data I send you on mission and asking you to bring data no matter what. Micro, macro, wrong, not wrong, because then you can always try to check, double check, cross check. But it's better than nothing. But I had the same problem once with Wolfenson, who was the president of the World Bank at one point, and I was doing the IDA replenishment. And he was always asking me, what is the present value of this? What is the present value of that? And I was really furious because I didn't know. And he could do the present value mentally. I couldn't. And I was pissed because I wanted to go for strategic direction, not for a freaking present value of that string of data or whatever. With that, my staff could do it. So I complained and I told him, I mean, stop asking me, the present value. I mean, I can do it like you on mentally, and my staff can do it on their computer, no problem. But what I want you is some strategic guidance. He was shocked, but he looked at me and I think he had a fantastic comeback. He said, listen, numbers are the X-ray to many problems or many issues. I think that could be a title for our little discussion. It's not mine. It's a better way to say what I told you when you were a young economist. But that's what Wolf and Son told me when I was a director for IDA.
So, Philip, we first met in the early 2000s. You were the manager at that time. It was called sector manager still of Southern Africa. That included Madagascar and Comoro Islands, which is also a region that you previously were responsible for as what you could be called the World Bank ambassador out of Madagascar. And I remember still, I went on this mission to Comoro Islands, and then you said, Wolfgang, bring me back data, as you just said, whatever it is, because you called it that time, and I think you stand by that. It cuts through a lot of crap. Um, Tell us a bit about that mindset, that quantitative mindset that you had and that you wanted to instill into your teams.
Again, it comes from some of what we discussed earlier. I mean, that is the link to the Ethiopia and everything, kind of a permanent search for evidence. And the problem with evidence is when you come with a very small detail, I mean, the problem is it material? So you met someone very rich in that country. It means that everybody is rich in this country? No, obviously. And whatever, I take this example just comes through my mind. So the problem is materiality. So you really need to find some data. And if you don't have structured, well-structured data with a good GDP, with everything behind the GDP very well documented, etc., then you have to try to your best to come close to it through proxies. And I think even if it's far from perfect, proxies that try to do that, to say what is the to grasp the situation and the materiality of this situation is better than nothing, or just what you heard at the hotel during the mission, or a couple of traders that you talk to. It's important, but it's, you see what I'm saying? So that for me was always kind of this drive to try to go beyond the simplification of and expediency of just picking a few things and either a full concept ideologic, but also just something, people are rich or they're poor or whatever, statement that try to capture reality, but behind it you need to document it. So this obsession to document, I think, came from that experiment in Ethiopia. You need to have the best possible diagnosis with whatever you have. If you have in a very data intensive country, great. So then you have a lot of other theories and how to use the data that you have at your disposals, and that's probabilities, statistics, no matter what. But if you are in a country where very little statistics, try to build them. Go interviews. That's why the bank use a lot of surveys. And it started in the 90s when we got into poverty under Wolfenson, by the way. But they are very useful. And I'm sure that where you stand now, you can witness to that. But what is a survey? Is to try again to have representative data so that you can make something out of it that is not wrong from inception, because the data behind is wrong. It's like, for me, I always like comparison with medical comparisons. If your diagnostic is wrong because you got the wrong temperature, you got the wrong x-ray, you got everything that as an input, everything is wrong, then you will have the wrong diagnostic that will lead to the wrong treatment that may lead to very serious conditions down the line. I think economics, it's a little bit the same, and social. So you need the data. For me, the x-ray, it's not a bad way to think about it. And when you, again, in a country where scanned data, go after it. It's not easy. You don't go behind. You can stay in some country. Everything is available, so it's great. But in some countries, not. So go for it, because there's always data. And you can find proxy. You have to be imaginative. You can find a lot of proxies, and then use judgment. Again, data doesn't exclude judgment. You have to apply still the judgment on the data. One thing I like very much at the World Bank is the exercise in PREM for the macro to go through modeling. We had the Rimsing X model, which was maybe very simplistic, but it forced you to ask some basic question. How can I grow if imports go down? Where will the equipment for investment come from? And if I cannot invest, how can I grow? I mean, basic stuff, because otherwise the system doesn't work. So I think that this is the strength and the power of data, but at the end, you need your judgment. So it's the combination that is powerful.
Thank you, Philip. Things have to add up, as you implicitly highlight here. And Philip, you obviously have been around for a long time in that field, and not just with the World Bank and its sister organization IFC, but also with the European Bank in London, and now as the chairman of the French Development Corporation. Um, what's your assessment of how far the development sector has come in providing good data? How much do you think the industry is at the frontier, and how much more could it do?
I think we went a long way on the positive side in improving data in all the sectors in many countries, including some very poor. Now, to go to countries where you have very little data, you really have to go to countries that are post-conflict or in conflict, but I saw during my career of 40 years, a huge improvement. Is it perfect? No. Can we improve? Yes. But we can say we can improve also in the most advanced countries. But I think we went a long way. I think that the quality of management in emerging markets have been improving, or public policy has been improving. And every minister of finance, prime minister or president wants to make sure that, like a pilot in the plane, there are tools to navigate, or in a boat. You need tools and numbers to navigate. So I think that, and then there have been a lot of efforts from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the UN, from bilaterals to help countries develop their statistical capacity. Are we there? Not. But we have made a huge improvement in my view. It's very hard to put a number, but I think that when I look at the countries, especially in emerging markets, it has been really impressive.
Good. Philip, you spoke a lot about the improvements, and obviously you inspired the young group of economists that I was part of. And then fast forward, you took over as the CEO of the International Financial Corporation, which is the largest, basically, I would call it equity institution in the development field, but equity, I think, in the non-World Bank way. Maybe you can comment to this in a minute. But tell us what your priorities were, and also how that empiric economic mindset was important to help, put IFC on the new track.
Well, I took the IFC because it was proposed to me by Jim Kim, the president. I left the World Bank because of him, of his reforms, but he called me back when I was in London. But I couldn't refuse because I saw from the World Bank side, I was frustrated by the fact that IFC, in my view, was not taking enough risk, was not going very much into Africa, or were very timid in Africa, but which is linked to a bit timid in terms of risk taking. I saw when I was VP for the East Europe that, for example, I mean, IFC was investing in private quasi-monopolies or oligarchs. I didn't like that because that is good for the bottom line, but not very good for the welfare of the people of these countries. I mean, we all know that monopolies, private or public, are not usually very good and destroy welfare rather than increase it. So I had this chance, so I took it. And then very quickly, I when I came from London to DC, I met the US executive director, who told me how welcome and you're now at the head of a second-rate commercial bank. That shocked me a lot because I knew there was improvement to be made in IFC, but that your number one shareholders tell you that, I mean, you're the head of a company now. Imagine your number one shareholder tells you that you're a second-rate commercial bank. I mean, this is not very good. And the worst is that they were right. The board was not happy. He was the most kind of direct, but the rest of the board was not very happy. And when I look at the numbers, here are the numbers again, they were right. Because as you know, in the World Bank, we have this independent evaluation that report to the board, and they go for every project and then evaluate ex post what have been the impact of the project. And then they rate it from unsatisfactory all the way to best practice and everything. But the average is kind of satisfactory. So if you take satisfactory and above, only 48% of IFC input projects were satisfactory and above. 48%, less than half. So it's like flipping a coin whether you have impact or no impact, which is horrible. So that was a huge. So I pushed very hard two things. One is more on the IDA countries, especially Africa, where we are doing much less than we should. And two, quantifying the development impact. After all, you quantify the projected internal rate of return of your investment. Why can we do it for the economic side on development impact? So we did that. It was a lot of work, and we had a whole new vice presidency headed by Hans-Peter Lankes to do that. So, and it was very successful, and it worked, because at one point the director started to go to the board with two numbers: internal rate of return, which is how much profitable is your project. But as I said, you can invest in an oligarch, it's very profitable, but it's not very good for the economy or the social or the whatever. But then you had another number, which was the development impact from 0 to 100, and done with a methodology that was quite rigorous, that generated a lot of data, by the way, and numbers. We had to go and dig deep, very deep in many sectors, in many countries. But we had a number, one synthetic number. So you go to the board, you say, well, we have an internal rate of return of 12, but a development impact of 60 out of 100. Then the board grills you mostly on the 60. Why, how, what are your assumptions? And the team has all of a sudden to defend that. And not only that it is good for the bottom line. So that changed completely the dynamics inside the institution, and directors started to pay attention, and their staff, to not only the finance, but also the economics and the impact of the projects, which was what I wanted. And also I developed, talking about data, a dashboard, very rich dashboard, because what is not measured doesn't get done. I believe in that. It's not, it's someone much more famous than me that said it. But I think it's true. So I started every month to have a very thick package, and I had everything. And again, that's the X-ray of Wolfenson. Really, with a few tens of numbers, you could capture everything what that was going on in the enterprise, in dynamics, and in stock, in flow, everything. So that was very useful. And then I called the whole reform drive, that was very hard, IFC 3.0, because it was not only an evolution, like we had evolutions before. IFC was first financing Siemens and multinationals going to third world country at the time, that in the 50s and in the 60s, sorry. Then they moved in the 90s to local corporates, but always with the same thing, the same offer. What I proposed was very different, which was to change the operating system. In other words, to become proactive, not reactive. The model of the IFC was we finance the private sector, but the private sector has to come, propose the project, and then we decide whether we finance it or not based on risk and price, but like any commercial bank. So that was a model. What I said is if we want to go to Africa and the poorest country on earth, we need to be proactive because there is not enough projects coming our ways in these regions. So becoming proactive entailed a lot of things, including having strategies, including pushing the World Bank to push some reforms to help the private sector to prosper. That meant imagining projects and then trying to find investors that would be interested and preparing and doing the work and the preparatory work for investors to come at the project level, at the sector level, at the economic level, directly and indirectly through the World Bank. So that was a completely shift. But for that, you needed a strategy. And for a strategy, you needed to have a very clear understanding of what was the situation for the private sector in that country. So I launched what came to be known the private sector diagnostics. And you worked on the one in Kazakhstan thing. And I was adamant that it has to be done with the bank and the IFC. One way to force better collaboration. I knew the bank had better economists, but I knew that they didn't understand a lot of private finance, and vice versa. In IFC, typically they understand private finance, but not necessarily economics. So that was a way to have the diagnostic as an input to the strategy of IFC in that country, proactive, and then pushing that into the global World Bank Group strategy. That was the idea, to be able to generate new projects that would not have come if we had just done nothing and waited for the system to come and bring us the project. So that's why IFC 3.0 is a shift in the operating system, as opposed to adding a geography or adding a new product. It was a way of thinking and of approaching the issue. And it worked, because I checked the numbers recently, because I had to make a presentation to the Asian Development Bank that was interested by IFC 3.0. And I checked that, in fact, we went from 19, 20 billion a year to 56 billion a year last year. So huge increase, thanks to the capital increase that we got, thanks to the IFC 3.0. So that strategy worked, but it was a huge amount of efforts and reforms, and not necessarily very popular. As you know, staff don't like changes typically, despite whatever they said. And that was a big shift in staff, because when you wait for a project to come and then decide whether you will finance it or not, is very different from you going out to find a project. Very different. And then we had to replace, in fact, 40% of the staff over 3 years or 4 years. So that was a big shift, but that was the cost of getting the capital increase, and in my view, survival of the IFC. Because as I started to say, the board was, and for good reason, it was quantified, becoming a second-rate commercial bank. Who needs that? We have plenty. I mean, you go to BNP Paribas, you can go to Mitsubishi Bank, you can go to JP Morgan. I mean, they are very good. If you try to do the same thing, you better privatize yourself and give the money to IDA then.
And I guess these guys are not second rate, right? These are first rate commercial banks. And just on this one, Philip, maybe as we close that broader substantive block, it's, again, congratulations to what IFC is now achieving, and you laid the foundation there now. But the IFC story, and I guess the World Bank Group story, is not not the regular, not the norm now in this current day and age. Obviously, the development sector is undergoing severe cuts, severe challenges. Obviously, fragmentation of the world, new players. and obviously maybe the victim of its own success because governments themselves have now most resources. Where do you put now IFC, the World Bank Group, in the broad architecture of development, and where you just see the development sector advancing the next decade or so?
Well, there's been a huge shift in the last few years in the sense that the success, in some sense, of the emerging markets, especially in Asia, but not only, but especially in Asia and Eastern Europe. I mean, these guys are catching up very quickly. You go to Poland now, I mean, it's European countries. I went to Poland 30 years ago. It was another world. You go to China now, it's unbelievable. When I went to China in '87 for AFC, by the way, as a young professional, it was feudalism. I mean, the technology was not there, very basic. So the progress has been unbelievable, unbelievable. Poverty alleviation has been, it's a miracle. I don't think that any other period in history we have seen such success in eliminating poverty, despite a huge increase in population. So, I mean, we can take some credit for, the post-World War II system of trade. I believe trade was very powerful, and development finance and stabilities through the IMF on the macro side worked extremely well. I think that we need to repeat that again and again. Now things change in some sense because you are victim of your own success. When I see that in Europe, some of the country or many of the country are more indebted than emerging markets. So they say, well, if we are, why should we borrow to lend to China? So there's a questioning in Europe, at least, and I think in the US also, to be honest, on aid that we knew for the last, 50 years, half a century. So there's a questioning and questioning is not a bad thing in itself. But I still believe that we are much better in the world that is prosperous than in a world where poverty increases fundamentally. So how do you morph this? So in my view, it's a transition because traditional donors are cutting aid for many reasons. They want to increase their defense spending. They don't have enough fiscal rule. Their population, the appetite for international aid is coming down. A mixture of all this. So it's going down. Emerging markets are not ready yet to put aid kind of in a non-mercantilist way and multilateral. Part of it is because of the governance of many of the MDBs is against them. So if you put more money in some of the regional development bank, you may not get the shares that goes with it. So it has to be reopened, but that's hard because those that are having the control don't want to lose it. So there's a governance issues. So the transition between Europe and traditional donors and potential new donors, we're a bit caught, and we are not yet. This transition is not happening and has not happened. Also, China is increasing, but we are still a long way. So that's one. And second, the type, because we have been successful, I think more and more will be on the donors on the private sector side, which was a little bit what I tried to do with IFC. So in my view, IFC should be as big as the World Bank. An economy should work on two legs, public and private. And the private was tiny compared to the public in the World Bank. This is changing, and I think this is the direction of travel. I don't anticipate massive increase to IDA. On the contrary, it will be harder and harder as time go by. IDA is for government loans subsidized or on concessional terms, which means donors have to contribute every 3 years. But IFC can continue to grow if they're ready to take more risk, to be creative, and to work upstream and work public-private. I don't know an economy that is completely private. I don't know even the pure communist country are not completely public. The reality is a mix of the two. The problem is where you put the cursor, but that's another story. So that's what I think, that it's going to be a difficult moment of evolution and change. And I see from on the bilateral, regional, and international, at all level, it's going to be harder. And but the private sector will have its, but everybody will have an incentive to improve private sector flows to emerging countries. But it has to be on a win-win, a win for the investor and win for the recipient countries. So that's, in fact, that's what I believe we're going.
Philip, thank you for your perspective and all your, I would call it, wisdom over decades of experience. And Philip, this podcast always ends with the question of your favorite number. So tell us your favorite number and the story behind that number.
A lot of people will give you their mother's birthday or their own birthday or something, I assume. But for me, when I thought about, because you warned me about the question, we have to be honest with everybody and transparent. I thought about it, and I think that really what, I don't know if it's my favorite, but the one that puzzles me and fascinates me the most is 0. I always thought, put yourself in the shoes of a caveman. You can count 1, 2, 3. You have one, one pig, 2 pigs, 3 pigs, or sheep, or whatever, or grains. But 0, the concept of 0, was not obvious. In fact, it was a huge breakthrough. I don't know who is a genius, or maybe a string of genius, to come, and apparently it came from philosophy from India, the concept of nothingness. But then how do you take this philosophical concept into a numerals? And that enabled you to do decimals, to do the 19. What is 19 in Greek, or in Roman, or 1957, my birthday? I mean, it's a lot of X and Y's and V's and stuff. It's makes no sense. So 0 for me is the most fascinating number for me. The guy that came up with it is one of the huge genius of the human history, in my view.
Well, 0, where math and philosophy meet. I didn't expect to end us on that note, but it's even more fascinating. Thank you so much, Philip, for being on the show.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Take care.